At 6:30 in the morning on the 27th day of August, in the ancient halls of Addis Ababa, the world witnessed a moment that history books will not easily forget. The African Development Summit was meant to be another gathering of leaders, another conference filled with polite speeches, cautious handshakes, and the predictable language of diplomacy. But on that morning, before the cameras of the world, a young president from Burkina Faso stepped forward and broke the silence of centuries. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, standing tall in his military uniform, did not bow, did not hedge, did not sugarcoat his words. He looked straight into the camera, his voice firm, his eyes unflinching, and he declared to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, "You have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here." The room froze. Pens stopped moving. Journalists glanced at one another in disbelief. This was not the language of threats. This was not the drumbeat of war. This was something older, deeper, more unshakable. It was the sound of dignity. It was the cry of a continent long ignored, now speaking with one voice. Within minutes, clips of that declaration leapt across the digital world. From Johannesburg to Kingston, from Washington to Lagos, people asked the same question. What was his 48-hour ultimatum? Was this the reckless daring of a young soldier turned president? Or was it the first strike in a new chapter of African sovereignty? My brothers and sisters, this is not just politics. This is not just about Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, or Burkina Faso alone. This is about respect. This is about whether Africa will continue to be spoken down to, or whether Africa will rise to speak for itself. Stay with me in this message, for in the next moments we will walk together through the story, its beginning, its fire, its consequences, and its meaning for the future. And before we begin, let me invite you, if you believe Africa deserves to be heard, if you believe dignity must never be negotiated, then subscribe to this channel, join this community, and let us carry this story to every corner of the world. In order to understand the fire of that morning in Addis Ababa, we must first step back and trace the spark that lit the flame. For an ultimatum so bold, so unexpected, does not come out of thin air. It was born in the shadows and whispers in the private chambers of power where leaders speak freely, believing the world will never hear their words. According to diplomats present at a closed-door G7 meeting, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu let slip remarks that carried the sting of insult and the weight of contempt. Words not meant for the public, but words that cut deep. He dismissed African leaders as political opportunists. He mocked their criticism of Israel's campaign in Gaza as naive, unsophisticated, militantly theatrical. He hinted, so the sources said, at backing IMF policies that would tighten the chains of debt around African economies. And then, in a flourish that felt like a slap to history itself, he suggested new Western-backed alliances that might once again sideline the sovereignty of Africa. When those words leaked, they spread like wildfire. Headlines blazed across African newspapers. Talk shows burned with outrage. On social media, a single phrase caught fire. Haka Africa is not your porn. It was raw, it was defiant, and it was repeated millions of times. From the crowded markets of Accra to the lecture halls of Nairobi, people shouted it aloud. Africa will not be demeaned. Africa will not be mocked. And yet, through all this noise, one man remained silent. President Ibrahim Traoré. He did not issue a press statement. He did not take to Twitter. He did not answer the chants of his people. Instead, he waited. He let the anger of a continent rise like a wave, and then, at the summit in Addis Ababa, he unleashed the tide. Picture it, my brothers and sisters. The great hall filled with leaders, journalists, and dignitaries. The air heavy with expectation. And there he stood. Young, unflinching, wearing not the suit of a politician, but the uniform of a soldier. He spoke not as one man, but as the echo of millions. His voice did not tremble. His words did not falter. Africa will not be your porn. Africa will not be the subject of debt chains or Western-sponsored experiments. You have 48 hours to apologize, or you will no longer be welcome on this continent. The hall fell silent. Delegates shifted uneasily in their seats. Journalists froze, their fingers hovering above their keyboards. It was as if time itself paused to listen. In that instant, Burkina Faso ceased to be a small West African nation known for its struggles. It became the epicenter of a diplomatic earthquake. A young president had dared to turn to one of the world's most entrenched leaders and demand an apology, not for himself, but for the dignity of a continent. Within minutes, the clip ricocheted across the globe. African diaspora communities from London to New York reposted it with pride. In South Africa, leaders called it the future of African diplomacy. In Kenya, former ambassadors declared, finally someone has spoken with clarity. It was not simply a moment of defiance. It was a rupture in history. For decades, Africa had been treated as a table to be sat at only when invited, as a participant only when convenient. But here was Ibrahim Traoré declaring to the world, Africa builds its own table. But as the applause rose online, as the hashtags trended, another question began to form in the minds of many. Could one man's ultimatum truly bend the will of a world power? Or was this a performance doomed to fade like so many fiery speeches before it? The clock began to tick. 48 hours. Not 48 days, not 48 weeks. A mere 2 rotations of the Earth around its axis. And yet, in those brief hours, the weight of decades, even centuries, pressed upon Africa's shoulders. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, radios buzzed with the ultimatum. In the crowded markets, sellers repeated it to one another as though reciting scripture. 48 hours. 48 hours. In villages scarred by conflict, people huddled around crackling broadcasts, listening not only for news but for the sound of their own dignity echoing back. Children in schoolyards, farmers in the fields, elders in community halls. Everywhere the same words. Traoré has spoken. He has given the world 48 hours. In that moment, the young president became something larger than his office. To some, he was Thomas Sankara reborn. To others, he was the embodiment of a long-silenced Africa daring to lift its voice. His popularity surged. Opposition leaders, once loud in criticism, fell quiet, unwilling to appear unpatriotic. A rare moment of unity had settled over a nation divided by insurgency and hardship. But it was not only Burkina Faso. The ripple spread across the continent. In South Africa, the foreign minister reposted the clip, writing simply, "Finally, someone has said it." In Kenya, a former ambassador to the United Nations declared, "This is what African diplomacy must become: fearless, incorruptible." Across universities in Ghana and Nigeria, student unions issued joint statements demanding the African Union stand firm behind Burkina Faso. The ultimatum had crossed ethnic, religious, and political divides. It had become a rallying cry. African dignity is non-negotiable. And beyond Africa, the reaction thundered. In Washington, debates flared. Some voices in government called the ultimatum reckless, dangerous, a move that could strain fragile alliances. Yet in classrooms from Howard University to UCLA, students cheered. African-American scholars and activists saw in Traoré's stance not recklessness, but clarity. The clarity of a people tired of bowing, tired of asking permission to exist with respect. In Harlem, marches erupted, echoing chants of the civil rights era. Africa stands tall. Africa stands proud. In Moscow and Beijing, the state media seized the moment, praising Traoré as a symbol of defiance against Western dominance. To them, his ultimatum was proof that the global South was rising, daring to speak back to the hierarchies of the old world order. In Europe, the response was careful, even nervous. Leaders in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels urged dialogue, cautious words masking their unease. They could sense the balance shifting, however slightly, however uncomfortably. And in the Middle East, the reaction split down the center. Some governments accused Traoré of provocation. Others, behind closed doors, quietly admired his courage. A small African nation forcing even Israel to pause and reconsider. But what of Israel itself? The very target of the ultimatum? The reaction was muted, almost dismissive. A short denial of the leaked remarks. No apology. No acknowledgement of Traoré's ultimatum. Only silence. Yet it was a silence that roared. For, in refusing to answer and brushing aside the demand, Netanyahu's government only fueled the fire. Analysts across African media declared, "This is proof of what we have long known. Our voices are brushed aside, not taken seriously." Instead of easing tensions, Israel's quiet denial made the ultimatum echo louder, stronger, fiercer. And so the countdown continued. The world watched the hours slip by. Governments issued cautious statements. Social media burned hotter. In Burkina Faso's streets, chants grew louder. To the farmers, to the students, to the displaced, this was not only about Israel. It was about centuries of dismissal reduced now to a simple question. Would Africa be heard? But as the final hours approached, another thought began to trouble many. What if Israel never apologized? What would happen then? Would the flame of unity turn to ashes of disappointment? Or would this ultimatum become the spark of a new era? The 48-hour ultimatum was not just a sentence thrown into the air. It was a stone cast into the still waters of global diplomacy, and the ripples spread far and wide. In Burkina Faso, the effect was immediate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, already known for nationalizing gold mines, building the country's first gold refinery, and distributing tractors to farmers, now stood as more than a reformer. He became a living symbol. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou, waving flags, chanting his name. In rural villages where hardship and displacement had stolen hope, families repeated his words around cooking fires. For once, their struggles were not invisible. They were part of a larger fight, a fight for Africa's dignity. His approval ratings soared. Surveys revealed that 2 out of 3 Burkinabe citizens now accepted military rule, compared to barely a quarter a decade earlier. Opposition voices faltered. To criticize him now was to risk appearing unpatriotic, out of step with the heartbeat of the nation. Even those who had once doubted him stood aside, acknowledging that he had touched a nerve deeper than politics. but the impact reached beyond national borders. Across Africa, the ultimatum became a catalyst. Student unions from Ghana to Nigeria called for economic sanctions against any power that disrespected African sovereignty. Commentators spoke of an Africa united not by trade agreements, not by convenience, but by a common principle. Dignity is non-negotiable. For the African Union, often accused of slowness and indecision, the ultimatum was a wake-up call. Urgent talks were held. Whispered reports suggested that several states were preparing a joint response if Israel failed to apologize. The very act of deliberation was historic. Rarely had the Union moved so quickly, so decisively, under pressure. And yet, as the tide of unity rose, so did the risks. International financial institutions began to murmur warnings. Could Burkina Faso's defiance frighten away investment? Could it invite sanctions from Western powers? Envoys from Europe and North America sought quiet meetings with Traoré's advisors, probing, testing, asking. Was this ultimatum only theater, or was Burkina Faso prepared to go beyond symbolism? Inside the country, human rights groups sounded alarms. Reports of forced conscription, arbitrary arrests, and suppression of dissent painted a darker picture. Support, no matter how fervent, could erode if promises of stability and prosperity remained unfulfilled. Still, the people did not waver. In their eyes, the ultimatum was proof that their leader was unafraid, that their continent could stand upright. The words had become more than politics. They had become prayer, anthem, creed. Beyond Africa, the consequences unfolded unevenly. In Washington, young African Americans seized on the ultimatum as a case study in sovereignty. University forums turned the moment into debate, celebration, and inspiration. In Harlem, diaspora communities poured into the streets, waving portraits of Thomas Sankara beside images of Traoré, declaring that a new chapter of African leadership had dawned. In Moscow and Beijing, state media amplified the ultimatum as a blow against Western arrogance. In Paris and Berlin, analysts warned that the old balance of influence in Africa was slipping away. The ultimatum had redrawn the map of conversation. Africa was no longer simply defending itself, it was setting the terms of dialogue. But as hours bled into days, a dangerous possibility loomed. What if nothing came of it? What if the 48 hours passed and no apology was delivered? Would unity collapse into disappointment? Would hope curdle into cynicism? Or would the ultimatum remain, not as a failed demand, but as a lasting symbol of resistance? And so the question lingers, my brothers and sisters. Was this ultimatum a true diplomatic victory? Or was it a dangerous gamble, a flame that could flicker out as quickly as it was lit? What do you believe? Share your thoughts in the comments below, for your voice matters in this story. Across the Atlantic in the corridors of Washington, the ultimatum of Captain Ibrahim Traoré landed like a thunderclap. Some policymakers dismissed it as reckless, the bravado of a young soldier intoxicated by power. They whispered that such defiance could fracture fragile alliances, complicate American strategy in the Sahel, and unsettle ties with Israel. But outside those corridors, a very different conversation was unfolding. In classrooms at Howard University, at UCLA, at Spelman College, students replayed the clip again and again. For them, it was not recklessness. It was clarity. It was the kind of clarity that strips away centuries of excuses and says simply, respect is not negotiable. In Harlem, the streets filled with voices. The African diaspora marched, waving flags of Burkina Faso beside the stars and stripes, chanting words that echoed from the civil rights era. Africa stands tall. Africa stands proud. To them, Traoré's ultimatum was not about distance. It was about kinship. It was about seeing in real time a young African leader refusing to bow before the weight of global power. Writers, scholars, and activists across Black America called it a moment of awakening. In their essays and podcasts, they compared Traoré's words to the speeches of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Not because of the content alone, but because of the courage it took to speak them before the eyes of the world. And this was not only an American story. In Moscow and Beijing, state media declared Traoré a champion of the global South. In Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, leaders grew cautious, their language diplomatic but their unease clear. Old balances of influence were shifting. In the Middle East, reactions were split. Some governments called the ultimatum dangerous, a provocation that risked escalation. Others, behind closed doors, admitted admiration. For here was a leader of a small, embattled nation daring to place even Israel on the defensive. What united these perspectives was one undeniable truth. The ultimatum had changed the conversation. No longer could Africa be framed only as a subject of pity, debt, or dependence. Ibrahim Traoré had shown that Africa could command the stage on its own terms with its own voice. But the question that lingered across continents was this: would this boldness fade into memory? Or had the young president of Burkina Faso opened a door that could never again be closed? My brothers and sisters, what happened in Addis Ababa was not just a passing storm. It was a signal fire lit on the highest mountain, visible from every corner of the earth. But the question before us now is not only what happened, it is what comes next. For even as the chants echoed and the flags waved, the road ahead for Burkina Faso and for Africa remained steep, filled with peril and promise alike. Traoré's ultimatum reminded the world that dignity is not a gift, it is a claim. Yet dignity alone will not fill empty stomachs, nor silence the guns of insurgency, nor replace the billions lost when foreign investors pull back in fear. The challenges are real. Burkina Faso is still a nation where millions are displaced by conflict, where violence has scarred the land, where stability feels fragile. International pressure will not vanish. Financial institutions wary of bold defiance may tighten their grip. Western powers unwilling to lose influence may seek new ways to exert control. But the promise is real too. Across the continent, young Africans are watching. They see a leader who did not whisper but thundered. They see a continent daring to stand tall. For them, this ultimatum is not an isolated moment. It is a seed planted in the soil of history waiting to grow into something greater. The African Union, long accused of slumber, has been stirred. Discussions once limited to trade and economics now stretch towards sovereignty and respect. If carried forward, this could mark the birth of a diplomacy no longer borrowed, no longer begged for, but fully African. And beyond Africa, the diaspora feels it too. From Harlem to London, from Kingston to Paris, people of African descent have tasted in Traoré's words a reflection of their own struggles, their own demands to be respected, not as shadows, but as equals. So the road ahead is both dangerous and divine. Dangerous because unity can fracture, promises can wither, and courage can falter. Divine because for the first time in a generation, Africa has spoken with one voice and the echo cannot easily be silenced. But here lies the question that no summit, no government, no scholar can yet answer. Will this ultimatum be remembered as a spark that died in the wind, or as the fire that lit a century of African sovereignty? And so, as the 48 hours passed and the world looked on, the answer came. Not in the form of an apology, not in the words of Israel Benjamin Netanyahu, but in something far greater. The answer was in the spirit of a people, the rising voice of a continent, and the unshakable truth that dignity cannot be delayed. For many, the question began simply, what was his 48-hour ultimatum? But by the end of the countdown, the meaning had grown deeper. It was not merely a demand for an apology. It was a proclamation, a declaration to history itself, that Africa would no longer beg for a seat at the table. Africa builds its own table, and those who wish to join must come with respect. The streets of Ouagadougou, the marches of Harlem, the whispers in classrooms, and the echoes in parliaments all spoke with the same conviction. Sovereignty is not granted, it is claimed. From the soil of Burkina Faso to the diaspora across oceans, the ultimatum became more than politics. It became prayer. It became prophecy. But the journey does not end here. My brothers and sisters, the question remains for each of us. Will we allow this fire to fade, or will we fan it into a flame that lights the path for generations to come? Will history remember this as a passing headline, or as the dawn of a new African century? That is why I ask you, not only as viewers, but as witnesses to this moment, what do you believe? Do you see in this ultimatum the courage of a continent rising, or the risk of a gamble too bold? Your thoughts matter. Your voice belongs in this story. So I invite you, share your heart in the comments below. Share this video with those who need to hear it. And above all, subscribe to this channel so that together we may carry this message further than any summit hall or diplomatic chamber. For in the end, when history asks again, what was his 48-hour ultimatum? The answer will not only be about Traoré or about Netanyahu, the answer will be about us, about Africa, about the dignity of every people who refuse to bow. May God bless Africa. May God bless all who stand for justice.